and Senior Research Fellow at the Voltaire Foundation. I would like to welcome all of you to the Oxford Early Modern French Seminar and to today's discussion around the publication of Colonialism and Slavery and Performance, Theater and the 18th Century French Caribbean, co-edited by Kareem Bernard and Jeffrey Leichmann. The book is published in the Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment collection, published by Liverpool University Press on behalf of the Voltaire Foundation. It's been my great honor and pleasure as general editor of the collection to work with the volume editors, and it's my great privilege to introduce the discussion today. I just want to thank, before I introduce the speakers, the conveners of the Early Modern French Seminar for welcoming us, and to the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities for making this possible. So our moderator for today's session is the co-convener of the Early Modern French Seminar and an internationally prominent scholar, Professor Catherine Assette. Catherine Assette is the Marshall Foch Professor of French Literature at University of Oxford and a University Academic Fellow at All Souls College, as well as a Fellow of the British Academy, the Académie Royale de Belgique, and the Academia Europa. She's the author and editor of many books and articles. In particular, I'd like to note La Fabrique de l'Intime from La Font in 2013, and Évariste Parny, Creole Révolutionnaire Académicien from Hermann in 2014. Her most recent publications are as co-editor, The Idea of Europe, Enlightenment Perspectives from Open Book Publishers in 2017, and Lettres inédites de Marie Antoinette from Albin Michel in 2019. She is also the co-editor, hot off the press, of an edition of Justiniana Wynn's Les Morlacs from Garnier. The two volume editors who will be presenting and discussing their work are Kareem and Jeff. Kareem Bernard is a poet, artist, playwright, scholar, teacher of Francophone literature and of the history of theater and dance in the West Indies. She's currently maîtresse de conférence habilitée à diriger les recherches at the University of Antilles and Martinique. Her research focuses on personal identity and subjectivity in 18th century comedy. Additionally, she has been working since 2013 on racial and gender stereotypes in literature and in contemporary dance in the West Indies. Several of the research-based creative works she has created with her students are available online at manioc.org. We'll post the link in the chat. She's also the co-founder of the Matrimoine Afro-Americano-Caribbean project, which is also an online art project, matrimoine.r. Her recent publications include a play, Demain, je pars pour Tlemcen, in 2018, a poetry collection, Télépathie ventrale, in 2018, and an edited volume entitled Poétique et politique de l'autorité, colonialisme, esclavagisme, exotisme, 18e ou 21e siècle, from Garnier. Her next research creation, funded by a grant from the Fondation pour la Mémoire de l'Esclavage, will be a staging of Les Veuves Créoles, an anonymous Martinican play from 1768, which has recently been edited and published by Julia Press. That show is scheduled for April of 2022. Jeffrey Leichmann is the Jacques Arnaud Associate Professor of French Studies at Louisiana State University, where his teaching and research focus on 18th century theater and digital humanities. He's the author of a monograph entitled Acting Up from Bucknell University Press in 2016. He's the project director for an interactive virtual reality simulation of an 18th century Paris Fair theater, which is supported by Digital Humanities Advancement Grants, and a related project sponsored by the French-American Cultural Exchange Council and the French Ministère des Affaires étrangères, which uses virtual reality to simulate the experience of proposed but unbuilt theater edifices in 18th and 19th century Bordeaux and New Orleans. He has a forthcoming work on the representation of Native Americans in 18th century French theater, and is also at work on a book-length monograph exploring the 18th century roots of persuasive theatrical performance, on which he recently published an article in French Studies. So it's my great pleasure now to hand things over to Katrina for our discussion.
Thank you very much, Greg, and welcome to everyone. So we are in virtual Oxford, and as you can see, it's extremely sunny here. I think we have something of the weather we might associate with some of the places where the texts of which Kareem and Jeffrey's volume speaks might have been first written. So just two housekeeping references. The first is to give you the order of our speakers. Jeffrey will be speaking first in English and then Kareem in French. And you may ask any questions you would like to ask in the chat in English or in French at any point, and then we will try and answer them at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jeffrey. Thank you very much for being here, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. And thanks as well to the Early Modern French Seminar, to Torch, to Greg, Katrina, to Karine, as always, and to those of you who are tuning in to listen right now. It's a delight to be able to talk about this project, which we're both very proud of. I'm going to begin by just presenting a little bit of the history of this project. The initial impetus for this was in a PUF grant, a Partner University Fund grant, obtained by the Louisiana State University Center for French and Francophone Studies, which at the time was under the direction of Alexandre Lupin. And it was a project that Alexandre had proposed in collaboration with Jean-Pierre Sainton, who is an historian of slavery at the Université des Antilles. And I also must mention Dominique Aurelia, who is the person at UA who really did the organizational work for this project. So they were granted this multi-year research grant to run an exchange between our two universities and to organize a couple of conferences on the history of slavery in the Caribbean basin. This led to a very rich graduate student exchange between our two universities and two conferences that ended up focusing on the work of Edouard Glissant as an historian and theorist of Antillean history. The proceedings of those two conferences have also subsequently been published. In 2018, Karine and I organized a conference at LSU, and I have to say that as part of the initial grant, Alexandre had solicited colleagues if you have projects, and I didn't particularly have a project, but I went and looked at the Université des Antilles Faculté des Lettres and who was teaching there, and I discovered that in someone who is a relative neighbor, which is to say considerably closer than my colleagues in France, who has a sort of incredible confluence of interests. And so I discovered that Karine is a specialist of 18th century theater with a strong interest in subjectivity. And these are, of course, topics that speak very much to me as well. And so I cold, sort of out of the blue, reached out and pitched a very vague idea for some kind of gathering. And initially it was going to be two conferences, which turned out to be a little bit too ambitious, but ended up being a really stimulating gathering in February of 2018 at LSU that was the initial seed for what would become this volume. My interests lie primarily in theater and performance. And so these are really sort of the strong lenses through which I see the work that we have done. And I think this is quite complementary with Karine's perspective, which is also rooted in theater and performance, but which is also very much rooted in a deep knowledge of Antillean culture. And this was a really important aspect of our collaboration as well. I have a personal conviction, as some of you who know me know, that 18th century theater is indeed a sort of privileged site of identity negotiation. This was the subject of my first book, In Early Modern France. And so one of the questions that I was interested in thinking about a project around representations of colonialism and slavery in the Antilles and representations of this Antillean phenomenon in continental French theater as well, was about how the 18th century colonial project inflects the sort of social aesthetic nexus of theater and performance in the ways that I had previously conceived of it. And a sort of working hypothesis, which you can trace in different parts of the book, is that this is truly a two-way street. The colony uses theater to preserve a connection to a kind of French identity and to establish through performance a world that reflects their own unique identity. And so performance works both to sort of bind colonies to mainland cultures, but also as a way to distinguish what is an authentically Antillean, in this case, major focus of the essays are really on Saint-Domingue, a sort of Dominguean social identity. At the same time, the theater in continental France, and again, this is one of my, and not my own, but one of the sort of theories to which I subscribe and which I find is productive in reading French theater of this period. One of the things that it does is help theater publics metabolize social and political phenomena. And this is, in terms of a social political phenomenon, the colonies, and particularly Saint-Domingue, are exceptionally important. The colonies transferred, of course, fantastic amounts of wealth to European cities. But this wealth, the source of this wealth, was increasingly at odds with the sort of progressive values that were espoused in particular by the people in the 18th century who viewed theater as an especially efficacious way to model comportment and sociability. And so the same sort of progressive thinkers who thought theater was a great school for refining people and refining morals had to sort of confront the horrible moral crime that was underwriting a lot of 18th century French wealth. This had the effect, and in the course of working on this, both the conference, my own contribution to the book, and then the much expanded collection of essays that emerged from this, my previous understanding of French theatrical culture has been significantly revised by the inclusion of colonial theater. And I think that also is one of the goals that I have for this book, is to perhaps confirm an intuition that scholars of 18th century theater might have, that there is something else that is not being said, or perhaps to alert scholars of 18th century theater and performance culture that there is a wider 18th century theater and performance culture in the French context that includes geographically disparate French possessions. I also feel that this, and this is something that for both Kareem and I was important really from the beginning of this project in 2017, that the representational questions around race and slavery make this particularly pertinent for today. And of course, the sort of coincidence of having this particular exchange that we're having right now, 2 days after the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death, brings home the fact that these are issues that haven't necessarily gone away. And I'll return to that briefly. It wasn't, of course, we could not have predicted what would have happened in the last year across the world, across America, certainly in Europe and in France, in terms of the critique of representations around the history of representing Afro-descendants. But it is a sort of confirmation that there is a lot of work to be done here. And this is one of the ways that this research remains relevant and really urgent today as well. I would say that my thinking on this project is influenced, of course, by many previous scholars, but there are two works in particular that I think help me frame a lot of my ideas, and they focus primarily on the Anglo-American Atlantic Circuit. And so the first one is Elizabeth Maddock Dillon's New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World. And I really appreciate this book. If you're not familiar with it, I think I highly recommend it. It, amongst its many virtues, shows how theater served as an important site of exchange between this sort of powerful and broadly accessible representational system that is theater. And I think particularly in the essays collected in our volume, the idea that French theater is widely accessible, that this is the way that certain kinds of social ideas filter down towards perhaps a less literate or perhaps less literarily inclined public, is really important, not least because most of the contemporaneous works that we're looking at belong to what are still considered sort of minor genres. And so these are vaudevilles, they tend to be pantomimes, there are sort of everything but the sort of classical canon of 18th century theater. There's not a lot of work in this volume because there was not as much performance of the great classics. Molière and Racine are not as present as this sort of popular theater. And I think that really drives home the point that theater was, and particularly these somewhat neglected genres, although they are right now, of course, the object of a very intense amount of critical attention, which is terrific. I feel like these particular genres of theater had a real possibility of speaking to a broad public that is perhaps less represented in strictly literary outputs. Professor Dillon's work shows how this serves as an important site of exchange between the theater as a sort of communication system and the public in a kind of continuous social political state that exceeds national boundaries. And so that, I think, is also a really important insight of this work, and something that was very helpful for me. And this, of course, draws on Joe Roach's formulation of circumatlantic performance from his landmark work, Cities of the Dead. I would say that the other important source for my thinking is Dror Warman's book, The Making of the Modern Self. And what I particularly appreciated, again, a work that's very, very rich about selfhood and identity in the early modern world, with a focus on sort of the Anglo-American axis, excuse me. And I think that the thing that really resonated the most for me was that Warman identifies the American Revolution as a signature trauma of English identity. And I thought this was a really interesting point, and an insight that had to have some kind of resonance with the kinds of reactions that rippled through France and through French society upon the loss of Saint-Domingue. Now, I also think that, in looking at this historically, there are a number of really significant differences between the English and the Anglo-American context and the French Dominican context. And so the present project is more than a sort of French version of these other works. I think that the racialized nature and the sort of almost exclusively racialized nature of the economic and political construction of the French sugar colonies, and the fact that it was African-born or African-descended slaves rather than the colonists who proclaimed first their adhesion to French revolutionary ideas of equality and then their independence as a nation, these facts and that sort of the racialized character of that initial break from the French Empire to declaring its own nation make the French case really quite a bit different, distinct in the way that each example of a general phenomenon will be, but also really compelling for the present moment. And so I felt like this was a project that, again, helped me make the bridge between 18th century studies and theatrical studies and the things that I'm really quite passionate about, and a wider world that I live in that sometimes cocks an eyebrow when I mention what it is that I do for a living. So we come to a kind of coincidence of publication in the year following the death of George Floyd and the international reckoning that it prompted with representations of Black people in Europe and America, confirms a kind of initial conviction that we had, that 18th century studies have an important place in contemporary conversations around representation and selfhood. I think that it's also important to note that what we are addressing in the early modern context really is state-sponsored venues. And we haven't dealt with private theater in the colonies very much. And I think that would be an interesting area of study that remains to be explored. But for the most part, these essays really are devoted to public theater in the colonies. I think that these issues of artistic representation in public are major areas that activists and scholars have identified as sources for propagating harmful racial stereotypes in contemporary culture. And so it seems like a particularly opportune moment to re-examine the historical phenomena, the authors, the performers, the audiences who shaped modern ideas around hierarchies, identities, and comportments. These questions continue to persist, and so it's interesting to measure the progress that might have been made, but also the work that still remains to be done, the ways in which contemporary systems of representation perpetuate the kinds of stereotypes and the kinds of representational modes that we see in 18th century theater. So this also partly motivates the decision to include research on current Antillean theatrical responses to the legacy of the French Atlantic slave trade. And this is something that Kareem will address in much greater depth. just to offer a glimpse of how artists on the ground did not wait, because again, all of this was in publication at the time, when international attention was really focused on these questions of representation and race. Artists on the ground have not waited for a signal from outside to start doing this work. They have been doing it all along. And they, in particular, in the theatrical space, have been doing this work about reclaiming the stage as a space for negotiating what it means to be French in the DOM, in the domaine d'outre-mer, département d'outre-mer, excusez-moi, and in general, in a global context, what it means to be French. And I think that as Kareem will show, some of the really interesting work, and as the essays also show, the essays by Kareem, Emily Sahaki, and Nadia Chanvin show quite clearly, the work that's being done by artists in the Antilles right now is very much addressing those questions. I would say that in terms of my goals for the volume and our shared goals for this volume, we were very much interested in showcasing current scholarship. And so we have contributors, and we made an effort, and this is one of the great advantages of collaborating across national university systems, to include people from around the world. And so we have American scholars, we have scholars from the UK, from France, including the French Caribbean, and even one contributor from Sweden. And in terms of that, the sort of question of where people are in their careers, we also have contributions from true luminaries in the field and from people who are still, or who are currently emerging scholars. And so I feel it represents a kind of state of the field. And that was one of the other goals, was to establish what might be a state of the field in 18th century French Antillean theater research. Part of the goal, of course, is to establish what remains to be done. And my sincere hope for this volume is that it incites people to do more research, because I think it's the strong conviction of everybody who contributed to this that there is more to be done. This is a potentially very exciting and rich vein of scholarship. We also were interested in explicitly putting 18th and 21st century worlds into conversation. And I should be clear that this is not because I think that research is only important to the extent that we can find some kind of analog in our current world. But I do feel that this particular research, and I think this is obviously a conviction that Kenny and I share, speaks powerfully to the history that we are confronting today. And so there is a real case for trying to establish some links between what we see today and the 18th century origins. Although, again, I am deeply appreciative of research that remains within that 18th century sphere. I felt that that was not going to be particularly possible with this topic. And so we embraced that and made it a part of the project. And I was delighted that Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment was open to this kind of chronological diversity as well. And then finally, interested in showing the dynamism and potential of historical studies, theater and performance studies, and French studies as we enter the third decade of the 21st century. And so these are all in America, in public universities. I teach at Louisiana State University, which is a public university in America. There is increasing pressure to turn out workers. And I want to educate people. I want to turn out educated college graduates. I don't want to turn out workers. And so somewhere we have to find that kind of compromise. And so I find myself looking for ways to make sure that my research is still speaking to my students and still speaking to the concerns that are in their world, while not abandoning the important sort of intellectual goals that I have around the 18th century. And so this project, I feel, answers both of those needs in a really satisfying way. And then I'll conclude by just talking about sort of what I think remains to be done. I think that there is an ongoing project of revisiting the canon, but in particular revisiting the canon not to get rid of it, but to unearth those places where it reveals its reliance on racist tropes. This is a little bit similar to, and many of you may be familiar with Michel Langino's work on Orientalist exoticism in French classical drama. I feel like there is this work to be done around sort of the presence of the colonial and the presence of slavery, somewhat occulted in French theater and performance of this period. And so I would just conclude with the very well-known quotation by William Faulkner: "The past is not dead. It's not even past." And I remain convinced that the fine essays in this work speak very powerfully to that idea. So with that, I would be delighted to passer la parole.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that eloquent presentation of what is at the heart of this particular volume, but what also is at the heart of our mission as educators. That was a fantastic presentation. Karine, je vais maintenant vous passer la parole puisque donc vous allez continuer et présenter en quelque sorte le même volume, mais vu de votre côté, et vous allez le faire en français, donc nous vous écoutons avec plaisir. Et je rappelle aux participants simplement qu'ils peuvent poser des questions. So if you have any questions you want to ask, do pop them in the chat at any point. Merci.
Eh bien, merci Katriona, merci beaucoup pour votre invitation, merci Jeffrey pour cette présentation, merci Greg et toute l'équipe des Liverpool Press. Merci d'avoir réalisé cet ouvrage magnifique, merci pour votre assistance à tout point de vue et merci à toutes celles et tous ceux qui nous écoutaient aujourd'hui. Je suis ravie de vous présenter depuis la Martinique. Merci aussi, j'ai oublié Catherine Ibet qui nous a également invités. Et je suis ravie de présenter donc depuis la Martinique mon point de vue, comme dit Katriona, sur cet ouvrage. Alors bon, Jeffrey vous a présenté un ensemble de choses importantes, tout l'arrière-plan personnel, historique, littéraire, etc., qui l'a amené à se pencher, à avoir l'idée finalement de ce projet, puisque c'est bien lui au départ qui avait eu l'idée d'organiser à l'Université d'État de Bâton Rouge un colloque on the stage of history. Et lorsqu'il m'a contacté pour travailler avec lui sur ce projet et donc co-organiser le colloque, dans le cadre de cette bourse qui avait été obtenue par le professeur Alexandre Lepin, eh bien, sur le plan de la recherche, je venais de déposer chez les Classiques Garnier, dans la collection Rencontres, une série Lire le XVIIIe siècle qui est justement dirigée par Katriona Seff et Jacques Berchtold, un ouvrage intitulé « Poétique et politique de l'altérité, colonialisme, esclavagisme, exotisme, 18e, 21e siècle ». Cet ouvrage donc mettait en dialogue des chercheurs de part et d'autre de l'Atlantique et il était centré sur les stéréotypes associés aux figures et personnages noirs dans la littérature, les arts et l'histoire. Et il traitait également des controverses et contributions ayant permis l'émergence de nouvelles formes d'altérité. Par ailleurs, sur le plan de la recherche-création, je venais de produire une pièce qui consistait en la réécriture d'une comédie de Louis de Boissy, contemporain de Marivaux, dramaturge dont je suis spécialiste. Cette pièce, la pièce de Louis de Boissy, était intitulée « La surprise de la haine ». Et j'avais donc réécrit, adapté cette comédie que j'avais intitulée « Histoire de Valais ». Et elle consistait essentiellement à revisiter la pièce et l'intrigue depuis le point de vue des subordonnés, des valets, qui étaient donc joués par des étudiants. Et sur cette figure des valets pouvaient se superposer à loisir celle des étudiants, des afro-descendants, des esclavisés, etc. Dans ce contexte, la présentation à l'Université d'État de Bâton Rouge d'une version courte de la pièce Histoire de Valais par les deux étudiants Malika et Silver constituait à la fois une forme de liant culturel entre ces deux régions, la Louisiane et la Martinique, aux histoires si proches. Et le fait de jouer cette pièce constituait aussi un contrepoint contemporain aux travaux de recherche scientifique qui étaient présentés pendant ce colloque, ainsi qu'un mode de questionnement implicite sur un rapport de pouvoir favorable aux Blancs depuis le XVIIIe siècle et qui ne s'est toujours pas véritablement inversé. Jeffrey a parlé tout à l'heure des questions qui étaient liées à l'actualité et effectivement, ainsi qu'en témoignent les travaux récents, par exemple de Sylvie Chalais, son ouvrage « Race et théâtre, un impensé politique », les acteurs et actrices à la peau noire restent encore cantonnés à des rôles stéréotypés qui ne leur laissent pas la possibilité d'exprimer leur talent et ils et elles sont sous-représentés sur les scènes et dans les écoles d'art dramatique. Ainsi, en proposant une pièce construite à partir du point de vue des subalternes, ce projet de recherche-création entendait réfléchir sur des questions de représentation, mais également sur la question des violences faites aux femmes, et également sur la difficulté des comédiennes noires à investir la scène et à prendre en charge des rôles du répertoire classique. Et il s'agit donc d'une question à la fois sociale et politique. Et d'ailleurs, Silver et Malika, deux étudiants afro-descendants de talent, étaient de milieux sociaux défavorisés. Et ainsi, la bourse obtenue par le professeur Alexandre Lepin leur a permis le rêve de voyager, de découvrir la Louisiane, ainsi que des cours à l'université dans un contexte universitaire et artistique très stimulant. Donc ces questions étaient déjà fondamentalement en germe dans mon travail. Et rejoindre Jeffrey dans ce projet nous a donné ainsi l'occasion, à lui, à moi, aux chercheurs et aux étudiants, l'occasion de jouer donc une nouvelle partition de l'histoire autour de ce terreau commun à nos deux régions géographiques et culturelles, celui du passé colonial esclavagiste. Cette nouvelle partition a consisté à analyser comment la scène en France et dans les colonies caribéennes du XVIIIe siècle à nos jours avait pu représenter la complexité de l'histoire coloniale et esclavagiste, mais aussi et surtout comment cette scène a pu jouer un rôle fondamental dans les processus de mise à distance critique du système esclavagiste, de créalisation et de création de nouvelles identités culturelles. Jeffrey en a parlé tout à l'heure. Ces questions ont pu être investiguées par des contributions telles que celles de Sean Anderson, Julia Press, Laurence Marie, Bernard Camier, pour ne citer qu'elles ici. Celles-ci, ces contributions montrent bien la complexité des pratiques performatives, des discours sur le théâtre, des représentations et des adaptations théâtrales qui, au XVIIIe siècle, d'un côté légitiment le pouvoir colonial et en même temps l'érodent de l'intérieur par les stratégies de résistance, la créolisation des textes et musiques et la venue progressive d'actrices créoles sur la scène. L'ouvrage issu de ce colloque me paraît donc présenter véritablement un moment novateur dans l'histoire du théâtre du XVIIIe siècle et également dans l'histoire du théâtre colonial et plus largement dans l'étude de la performance. En mettant ainsi au centre de ses préoccupations les questions des représentations de l'esclavage caribéen et des colonies caribéennes, il vient, comme le disait Jeffrey, combler un manque et il permet d'agir sur l'histoire des représentations. Et il me semble que cette notion d'histoire est fondamentale, je vais en reparler. Cet ouvrage prend notamment en compte dans sa troisième partie l'héritage colonial du XVIIIe siècle sur les scènes des Antilles à l'époque contemporaine. Or, ces articles montrent bien combien les héritages coloniaux demeurent fondamentaux dans les créations scéniques des Antilles d'aujourd'hui, mais également, également dans les corps et la recherche incarnée, comme donc Embodied Research, comme le montre si magistralement Émilie Saakian. Et je dirais qu'il me semble qu'il y a véritablement une unité dialogique de cette troisième section de l'ouvrage qui s'inscrit finalement autour des héritages de Fanon, de Frantz Fanon et de Édouard Glissant. En effet, tous les essais présents dans cette dernière section, et je lance un petit peu en germe une discussion possible, travaillent sur les questions de stéréotypes issus de la période coloniale, sur les corporéités, le rapport à l'histoire et la créolisation, avec un focus sur la double figure de subalterne que constitue la femme noire. Et il me semble que les questions qui sont en germe dans toute cette troisième section sont autour de l'histoire. Peut-on écrire l'histoire qui n'a pas été écrite? Comment écrire cette histoire? Comment dépasser l'oubli? Comment dépasser les stéréotypes et les assignations? Comment redonner une agentivité? Enfin, comment faire valoir, comment montrer qu'il y a eu véritablement agentivité des esclavisés, même si ce sont aussi des questions qui parcourent tout l'ouvrage. Et la dernière section, en particulier, travaille à la fois pour répondre à ces questions en imbriquant la fiction, le savoir du corps, Embodied Research, le travail sur la créolisation des textes, des codes chorégraphiques, des points de vue, et sur la production de nouveaux modèles de rapports sociaux de sexe. Donc, ce qui me frappe, c'est la grande cohérence de cet ouvrage. Et je terminerai en disant qu'il a constitué également une véritable rampe de lancement de mon côté pour un ensemble de projets et de collaborations fécondes. ce qui quand même me paraît assez exceptionnel, c'est-à-dire que il y a eu ce colloque, il y a eu cet ouvrage, et lors de tous ces projets, des rencontres ont émergé qui, comme le suggérait Jeff d'ailleurs, viennent déjà donner un prolongement au livre. Ainsi, j'ai entrepris, de mon côté, j'ai noué un travail de collaboration avec Émilie Saakian, avec qui j'ai coécrit déjà 2 articles à paraître et que j'ai invité dans mes séminaires de master et doctorat ici en Martinique, et qui m'a également invité dans son séminaire de doctorat à l'Université de Géorgie. Et l'autre belle rencontre a été celle de la professeure Julia Prest. Son travail sur les blackface est tout à fait fondamental et m'a passionnée, qui montre l'ambivalence de ces emplois, puisqu'il réassure d'un côté le pouvoir des Blancs et les discriminations raciales, tout en montrant au fond une forme de sympathie et une sorte de continuum culturel entre les Blancs, ces Blancs capables d'imiter les Noirs, et la population noire de Saint-Domingue, à la fois autre et familière. Je cite Julia Prest. Et Julia Prest avait par ailleurs réédité Les Veuves créoles, une comédie anonyme martiniquaise de 1768 dont parle notre introduction. Et Julia Prest avait indiqué que cette comédie était la première œuvre littéraire martiniquaise publiée et la première pièce relevant du théâtre colonial francophone. Bon, de son côté, François Regour, dans un article Lumière coloniale, indique que des opéras, des comédies ou des drames ont été créés et enterrés dans les théâtres de Saint-Pierre, donc pendant l'incendie lié à l'éruption de la montagne Pelée. Donc il s'agit là d'une pièce unique. J'ai obtenu en 2020, très récemment, un label ainsi qu'une subvention pour mon projet de recherche-création. Il s'agit d'adapter, de réécrire cette comédie pour les étudiants de mon université, l'Université des Antilles, en intégrant des extraits de Procès d'esclavisés issus de l'ouvrage dirigé par Dominique Rogers, Voix d'esclaves. Julia Prest donc, est dramaturge de mon projet avec Dominique Rogers, et elle devrait se rendre en Martinique en avril 2022 pour la représentation de la pièce, et sans doute aussi Jeffrey, ce qui nous permettra à la fois de présenter la pièce et d'ouvrir une séance de discussion au public, et par la même occasion de présenter notre ouvrage, Colonialism and Slavery in Performance. Voilà, je terminerai donc ici sur une citation que j'ai trouvée magnifique et extrêmement signifiante de la conclusion de l'article de Dubois and Glover, et qui me semble résumer à la fois un peu mon propos et lui donner des prolongements implicites. To write for and to play on the stage is to act as if another world is possible, as if another world is already present. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Karine, pour cette présentation tout à fait passionnante. So just a reminder, you may ask questions by putting them in the chat and we'll endeavour to answer them, whether they're in French or in English. So I'll bring Jeffrey back in. Thank you. And I'd like to set the ball rolling by asking a question which, in a sense, I think bridges what both of you have been saying or referring to. And the question is, in a sense, what role or what roles are there for the slaves? If we look at the question of the colonialism and slavery and performance, what roles do they have? How are they represented on the one hand, and what do they actually do on the other? Alors, vous avez compris ou vous voulez que je traduise? C'est bon?
C'est bon, merci.
I don't know who wants to start.
I'm happy to take a first crack at this, and I think that Kareem can probably fill in as well. I think that one of the things that emerges across these essays is that there is relatively little direct representation of Antillean slavery in French theater. That is something that is not very often confronted in a direct way. I think that what the research shows is that we have to interrogate the archives in a slightly different manner to sort of suss out what enslaved populations were doing. They were present in the house. They were present as performers. They were present as musical performers, which is in the I'm sorry, Plantation of Paradise, David, I'm sorry, her name is escaping me for a moment, but this is a volume that speaks to the role of Afro-descendants as actual makers of performance, and particularly musical performance. We have some indication from the archives that Afro-descendants did sometimes perform, and then in representations of people of African descent, there is the whole question of blackface. But in terms of where do slaves appear in the dramatic literature, this is the topic that Catherine Ramon takes up. And it turns out that slaves appear much more frequently as a kind of generic term in sort of things that are set around the Mediterranean. And then they appear very much as sort of abstracted figures in particularly in, for example, L'Île des Esclaves by Marivaux. And I think that, again, sort of looking a little bit more closely at the sort of genetic origins, if you will, of, for example, Marivaux's piece. I know that Catherine cited a recent piece of research by, everybody's name is escaping right now, Scott Sanders, about the fact that Marivaux's L'Île des Esclaves is probably influenced by the 1724 revision of the Code Noir for the Louisiana territory. And so the issue with this research, and one of the things that makes it both complicated and also really sort of fascinating, is that you have to push a little bit harder. It's not particularly offered up as sort of, here are all of the plays that are about Antillean slavery. I think that instead we're looking at what was performed and how can we read this performance as also about Antillean slavery, because in the Saint-Domingue context, slavery is the overwhelming fact of life. Slaves represent between sort of 75 and 85% of the total population of the colony. And so slavery is everywhere. When you go into the theater, how does that continue to be the case? And I think that that's sort of the interesting challenge for scholars. Karine, do you have...
Oui, merci Jeff. Je pense que oui, voilà, j'adhère à ce que Jeff vient d'expliquer. Et justement, ce qui m'a beaucoup intéressé dans Les Veuves créoles, c'est qu'il y a une esclave, enfin Julia Press l'explique dans son introduction, on pense que c'est une esclave parce que justement, elle ne parle pas. Et donc, la maîtresse s'adresse à elle en créole. C'est juste une réplique et elle lui dit de lui apporter de l'eau en créole. Et du vinaigre, en fait, de l'eau. Et du coup, Julia Press a trouvé que c'était extrêmement intéressant parce que c'était un des rares moments où justement la figure de l'esclave apparaissait et en même temps, elle apparaît dans le silence. Donc, c'est bien la preuve que, comme dit Jeff, c'est presque une figure abstraite, effectivement, et qui ne dit rien d'elle. Et c'est précisément pour cette raison que je veux travailler sur ce projet, dans lequel mon idée, c'est d'étoffer ce personnage, au fond, et de rendre la parole à ces gens qui ne l'ont pas, et donc, puisque finalement, la parole des esclaves a été assez directement entendue, puisqu'en France, il n'y a pas d'esclavisés qui auraient rédigé des récits, donc ces procès d'esclaves viennent redonner une parole à ceux qui n'en avaient pas. Et c'est vraiment un des rares emplois dans la comédie où l'esclavisé est représenté plus ou moins directement.
Merci. Et je crois que vous soulevez là aussi, Karine, une question qui est celle de retrouver donc les voix de ceux qu'on n'en a pas. Jeffrey a dit les archives ne sont pas là où on s'attend à les trouver. Donc, on est à la fois en tant qu'historien face à des absences de documents et pour vous, en tant que créatrice, face à des absences de témoignages. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on supplée à ces manques? Où est-ce qu'on trouve de quoi combler ces silences?
Bon, là, pour ce travail, alors, ce qui est intéressant, c'est comment dire, le recours à une sorte de double méthodologie. D'un côté, effectivement, essayer de travailler avec des textes d'archives nouveaux, parce que c'est vrai que les procès d'esclaves, ce sont quand même des textes qui ont été publiés. Donc, celui de Frédéric Régent, Libre et sans faire ou de Dominique Rogers. Donc, ça me permet de travailler quand même avec des archives. Alors, ce qui est extrêmement intéressant, c'est que récemment, j'ai eu une discussion à ce sujet avec avec Myriam Cotias, directrice de recherche au CNRS et donc spécialiste des questions des esclavages de l'esclavage. Et je lui ai demandé, parce qu'en fait, les procès sont en français. Et je lui ai dit, donc, est-ce que vous avez ces archives en créole? Et elle m'a dit non. En fait, il y avait une traduction des procès, et le texte qui a été fixé, c'est le texte en français. Et donc, par exemple, on a déjà même pas le texte originel. Et ça, je trouve que c'est passionnant parce que mon idée, c'est de travailler avec les étudiants. On va inverser les choses sur la façon dont eux, finalement, pourraient se réapproprier maintenant ces textes en français pour les dire en créole. Donc ce qui m'amène à ma deuxième forme d'approche, qui serait justement cette approche par la recherche incarnée. Qu'est-ce que les corps aussi peuvent nous dire de ce qui a été transmis? Et c'est pour ça que je vais également travailler autour du quadrille, danse traditionnelle guadeloupéenne. Et bon, pour la Martinique, c'est la haute taille, mais je m'en tiendrai au quadrille, qui a été transformé, donc conservé et transformé pour fournir une production culturelle totalement finalement différente et innovante. Et je vais m'intéresser à ce que le quadrille aussi peut dire des corps et peut dire de la culture des jeunes étudiants, des étudiantes d'aujourd'hui, à ce que la façon dont ils vont réinvestir ce patrimoine qui est totalement oublié peut nous dire aussi de ce qui leur a été transmis ou de ce qui ne leur a pas été transmis. Et en ce sens-là, je m'inscris bien en dialogue avec mes collègues, justement, et notamment avec Émilie Saakian, qui travaille aussi sur les archives et les corps.
Merci. Jeffrey, did you want to add anything on archival sources in a more sort of traditional vein?
Well, I like that your formulation of the archive is not where we expect it to be, which is to say that the kind of, I think that the kind of reading that is required is maybe not what we are used to doing. And so even in interrogating traditional archival sources like playtexts, like information about sort of disturbances in the theater, we're used to reading them for what they say. Very frequently, we're now reading them for what they do not say. This is sort of consistent with what they do not say, what they explicitly exclude. This is part of that sort of nouvelle partition de l'histoire that Kareem brought up. Is it may be that we are looking at the same lines of music, but we're going to play them quite differently, and that we're going to have to pay more attention to those places where maybe there isn't an explicit musical voice. What is in that silence? And I feel like that is one of the big challenges, but also, again, thinking about sort of how to make the field writ large really sort of speak compellingly to people today. I do feel like we can work with the materials that we have because there is a lot that simply hasn't been exploited, that simply hasn't had the kind of scrutiny that maybe perhaps the major authors have.
Thank you. We have a question from Vincent Roy Guiaza, who says, would you say that during the last third of the 18th century, theatre followed the growing turn of public opinion across Europe against slavery, or did it rather impulse such views? And what was the importance of theatre in spreading anti-slavery sentiments, especially in comparison to other popular genres at the time, such as traveling literature or travelogues?
So I would, again, just sort of jump in initially. I think one of the interesting things about working with public theater is that there are a great many constraints on what one can say in the public theater in France in the last third of the 18th century. And so this is one of the things that authors are confronted with all the time. So we have a play like La Négresse au pouvoir de la reconnaissance by Radé Barré, which takes a very explicitly sort of anti-slavery stance, and at the same time, the play itself is a vaudeville. It is something that is not sort of excoriating slavery in the same way that Olympe de Gouges' L'Esclavage des Nègres might a little bit later. But those two examples really stand out as two that are explicitly sort of looking at the humanity of Afro descendants and saying slavery is a crime. Otherwise, there is relatively little direct confrontation of that, again, on the public stage. And this has to do with a number of things. The theaters had to make money, and so they had to put on shows that they felt that people would watch. And it's unclear that there was necessarily a strong appetite, particularly, and again, we're looking mostly at sort of popular theaters, as opposed to the Comédie Française, although I don't necessarily think there was an appetite for that there either. It's unclear that there was a strong appetite for a strongly abolitionist sentiment in sort of pantomime and vaudeville theater. And then there's also a lot of limits on what you are allowed to say. And there's simply a lot of things that you are not allowed to represent. And so I think that some of the most revealing studies, I think in particular of Béatrice Ferrier's study, show how the same play, and in this case, L'Héroïne Américaine, is performed differently in France as it is from its performance in its touring performance in Saint-Domingue. And this is sort of where we see the theater directly responding to the fact of slavery on the ground. But I think that you see much more explicitly anti-slavery works in the domain of the novel, which was subject to less sort of censorship and scrutiny in terms of content because its consumption was entirely private. And so the public consumption of theater makes it a space that the authorities deem potentially dangerous. This is a way to federate people, to get their emotions all excited at once, and then you have a mob of people. And so the authorities were quite careful to vet plays for their sort of political messaging. One exception to this that you can see again in this volume is La Liberté Générale, which is a play that is prepared as the convention is preparing to announce the abolition of slavery. And so it really is a sort of adjunct to a big declaration that is about to happen. And this is a very explicitly anti-slavery play, although it's unclear that it was ever performed. And so again, that question of sort of the publicity of theater and the performance of theater makes it very difficult for theater prior to the sort of Le Pelletier law, the liberation of the theaters, the elimination of theatrical censorship. It makes it very difficult for theater to express a lot of the sort of directly anti-slavery sentiment that we see in philosophical works and also in certain abolitionist novels at this time.
Thank you. Karine, vous voulez rajouter quelque chose?
Pas vraiment. Je pense que Jeff a dit beaucoup de choses importantes et je pense que parfois le théâtre lui-même souvent le théâtre lui-même est ambivalent par rapport à ces questions. Et justement, l'article dont parlait Jeff, que j'ai trouvé passionnant, Marivaux et le Code noir, a été totalement inédit dans le champ des études en travaillant sur les textes et en montrant que finalement, là où on ne l'attendait pas, même le théâtre de Marivaux, qui quand même est plus éloigné était encore éloigné de la Révolution, déjà, peut-être, parce que finalement, ce sont quand même des hypothèses qui tiennent parfaitement la route, hein, mais on ne peut pas être sûr, mais peut-être déjà constitué déjà un argumentaire contre l'esclavage. Donc, je pense que la question est extrêmement intéressante et complexe quand même si, effectivement, comme l'a dit Jeff, il y a les essais des auteurs dans cet ouvrage montrent bien que le théâtre est quand même au service d'un vrai discours très souvent de plus en plus anticolonial.
And if I might just add one more, the essay by Frederick Thomason about the presence of slaves and slavery on the stages of Stockholm, it does a good job of showing how in a country that had never been a slave power, that became a slave power with the purchase of Saint-Barthélemy from France, suddenly is confronting all of these questions around slavery in its theatrical culture. And I think that that's an interesting indication of the way that slavery in a culture and in a country where slavery had been very, very far from their sort of national ethos and also, frankly, their sort of political and economic structure. When they become a slave nation, theater then does become a way to work through those issues. It's more complicated in France, where slavery was such an important part of sort of the economic and political development of the mainland territory. I think there was a greater reluctance to confront it head on.
Thank you. Je voudrais revenir à la question des conditions de représentation des pièces, puisque vous parliez, Karine, justement de la même pièce qu'on peut jouer différemment selon si on la joue en métropole ou dans les Antilles. Et Greg Brown nous demande si le théâtre commercial des colonies atlantiques peut être mis en relation en termes de répertoire, de type de spectacle, etc., peut-être avec le théâtre de la foire de la métropole. Est-ce que ce serait une analogie possible ou pas?
Vous parlez de... Enfin, quel théâtre exactement il mettrait en lien avec le théâtre de la foire, le théâtre de...
Le théâtre joué aux Antilles, les pièces jouées aux Antilles, est-ce qu'elles sont jouées dans des conditions qui sont analogues aux conditions de
actuellement.
De représentation? Alors, il ne pose pas la question, mais il ne précise pas.
Parce que, en fait, sur ces questions, c'est vraiment Stéphanie Bérard qui a fourni un gros travail dans son livre, dont je n'ai pas le titre exact en tête là. C'est vrai qu'il y a toute une tradition orale, effectivement fondamentale aux Antilles, qui mêle au fond qui mêle au théâtre le conte. Et donc toute la partie, oui, purement orale, transmise, etc. Et en ce sens-là, oui, selon des schémas qui se répètent, et ce sont des spectacles plutôt qui se faisaient dans les veillées. Donc, en ce sens-là, oui, je pense que le rapprochement pourrait être intéressant. Mais ceci dit, à l'heure actuelle, ce n'est pas la tendance dominante du théâtre aux Antilles. Enfin, c'est quelque chose qui a été transmis, qui est quand même encore là. Mais les compagnies, à l'heure actuelle, se battent plutôt pour être reconnues et pouvoir aller jouer dans l'Hexagone, justement être achetées par des théâtres de l'Hexagone, etc., et jouer dans des conditions analogues à celles des compagnies de l'Hexagone. Donc, je dirais que actuellement, la problématique est plus celle-ci, dans la mesure où la politique culturelle est toujours actuellement en défaveur, pour plein de raisons, en défaveur des théâtres des Outre-mer, des compagnies des Outre-mer.
Merci. And what about the 18th century, Jeffrey? You looked as though you wanted to come in.
Yeah, well, I think the question is interesting. Is it analog to the Théâtre de la Foire? One of my other projects is around Théâtre de la Foire and dispelling certain still persistent myths about the sort of primitive and disorganized conditions that might have prevailed there. These were very sophisticated theaters that had, technologically were absolutely on par with the officially, I don't want to say licensed, privileged stages. And I suppose what really distinguished them was that they, the barrier to entry was much lower, they were less expensive, and so they tended to sort of drain a larger cross-section of French society. I think that it's interesting that the colonists were interested in establishing theaters. That this was one of the important things in this colony, was to establish a theater, again, to sort of recreate and establish a continuity of identity with what it meant to be an urban dweller in France. And so they really considered themselves to be in France. And one of the great things about the cover of the book, it reproduces this lovely map from the John Carter Brown Library that shows really, you can see where the theater is located, indicates the sort of status that theater has in this society, where it is right at the end of the long, broad avenue. And so there's a long perspective to watch carriages arriving. It is right across from the center of government. And so you can see the sort of, and this is in Le Cap. And so you can see the sort of large governmental complex right across the street, and it opens onto a public place. And so theater was very much central to the urban identity of the colonies in the late 18th century. In terms of how the audience might have interacted, I think these are things that you see a lot of in the first section of our book. And I'm thinking in particular of Logan Connor's essay on the influence of the massive influence of the military presence on the repertoire. So what are we going to show? We're going to show things that, because there are so many soldiers garrisoned relative to the population in these towns, we're going to show things that are generally sort of themed around the military. And a lot of them are really very comic, sort of arlequinade around the military. Similarly, Bernard Camier's work on Creole performances indicates that the people who were in the audience were also people who were interested in and able to understand the elaboration of a whole different linguistic identity, which carries with it, of course, social and cultural identities as well. And so I don't know if the question was about sort of the physical installation of the theaters or the audience of the theaters. I think Lauren Clay's work on the business of French theater, and in particular her chapter on colonial theater, talks about the sort of racial divisions that you would see in the theater houses, and the fact that there was a part of the house that was for free people of color and a very small part of the house that was available for slaves. And so there were, in this audience, which is really a mostly white colonist planter audience, there is still this other presence that is there watching. And as anybody who has been to the theater or made theater knows, the audience is a member of the production. The audience is creating the spectacle with what's on stage. And so those forces are present. They're the ones that tend to be the least spoken of. And that's, again, sort of the challenge of that many of these essays rise to meet.
Thanks. In 18th century France, a lot of accounts of performances that we have talk about unruly behavior, talk about, you know, the police being called in, talk about fights and, you know, somebody being pickpocketed and so on. What do we have about the sort of climate of these performances in Saint-Domingue and elsewhere? Do we have things like police reports, accounts of tumult and so on?
I think that most of the archival sources are not, I mean, I know that Jeff Ravel's work on using police reports to sort of excavate the life of the public has really opened up a whole new perspective on what 18th century theater audiences were and what they were doing. I think that the accounts that we have are much less rich in the Antilles. The population of people who could go to the theater is significantly smaller, and I think importantly is culturally perhaps more, or politically perhaps more homogeneous, that there is not necessarily that sort of frondeur presence of a parterre that might have different political desires from the authorities that allow the theater to happen. So I think that there is less of this sort of civil unrest issue. They did have some problems initially keeping their theaters open, which is to say, attracting a consistent audience that would, and there was never a successful resident company in the Antilles. There were always touring companies that came because they couldn't, in fact, sort of consistently generate with the population of people, again, that was allowed to attend the theater, enough ticket sales to sort of keep a permanent company open. So I think there are less of those internal conflicts. They don't necessarily play out in the theater audience the way that we see them in France. And the archival sources are also different.
Et comment est-ce qu'on fait si on est esclave pour assister à un spectacle au XVIIIe siècle? Donc il y a une place pour les esclaves.
Alors,
dans le
bon,
public,
visiblement, Julia Prest insiste énormément sur le fait que les esclavisés sont surtout présents, sont partout présents au théâtre, mais essentiellement en tant que musiciens et que danseurs. Mais dans le public, il y aurait des livres de couleur et c'est tout. Et encore dans une proportion très faible, un peu plus à Saint-Domingue qu'en Martinique. Mais en fait, c'est ce que je trouve toujours, c'est justement lors de cette même discussion avec Myriam Cotillard, j'étais étonnée par ce paradoxe, c'est-à-dire les esclavisés sont partout et en même temps, ils n'ont pas un accès direct à ce qui se joue, justement. En tant que, enfin, un accès libre, un accès comme spectateur. Et ça, c'est un phénomène complètement paradoxal. Ils sont là comme présence absente, quoi. Enfin, en même temps pleinement présents dans la mesure où sans eux, pas de spectacle non plus. Je ne sais pas si Jeff, tu veux ajouter quelque chose.
Well, I would just say that Sean Anderson's article on dance performances amongst enslaved communities is also instructive in that sense, where there was other performance outside of theaters that was made by and made for the Afro-descendants who were slaves on these islands. And that's, I think, certainly a place where he's looking a lot at sort of police records and the criminalization, the evolution of the laws, the repressive laws around these dances. But I think that's a place where there's certainly room to do a great deal more work, and there's already great work being done, but on the sort of cultural productions of enslaved people. And that I think is where, if you want to talk about what enslaved people's access to performance was, it's going to be much more in these less organized, outside of the architecture of the theater, theatrical manifestations.
Thank you. And we have a question from Elisa Cazzato. Were theatre administrators in the colonies interested in importing from Europe the most skilled theatre artists and artisans, designers, machinists, architects, etc.? Because, for instance, Italian stage designers were highly requested in Europe and Russia. Is there any similar situation in the French colonies, where they'd want to import experts, where they'd like to sort of bring in the best troupes and the best architects and so on?
Well, touring troops were lured principally by the promise of money. And so the promise was that they would be able to make money touring in the colonies. And this was, in particular, Béatrice Ferrier's article about César Ribier and his company touring the Antilles goes over some of that. And again, Lauren Clay's work on the business of theater has a really instructive chapter on touring groups in the colonies as well. I think the question about designers, and I know that this is a particular interest of questioner with whom I've had some exchange as well. I think it's a great question. I can't rightly say. My instinct would be that they probably did not necessarily hire the best Italian designers to come to the Antilles, but I must admit that it's a question that merits further exploration that I would not be able to authoritatively answer. But it's a great question. It's very interesting.
Et alors, autre question justement sur les décors de théâtre, puisqu'on parle là du décor. Est-ce qu'on a un sens quand il y a une pièce, vous avez dit que la même pièce est jouée très différemment en métropole et à Saint-Domingue, mais est-ce qu'il y a des éléments qui persistent? Est-ce qu'on essaie de recréer un décor analogue ou un costume analogue, par exemple?
Alors là,
ou est-ce qu'on ne sait pas?
Je pense que Béatrice en parle un petit peu, mais
oui, mais
le problème, c'est
qu'on a des images de l'atelier de décor qui a fait les décors pour la représentation, pour le spectacle en France, mais on n'a pas d'image pour le spectacle à Saint-Domingue. Et donc là, c'est pas évident. J'imagine que les costumes ont quand même fait le voyage à travers l'Atlantique avec les acteurs.
Oui.
Mais les décors, c'est vrai que je ne saurais dire, et c'est très intéressant.
Moi non plus, oui, c'est une question effectivement sur laquelle nous pourrions nous pencher, en effet. Oui, oui. Ça mériterait un second.
C'est parce que je pense, vous savez, aux représentations d'opéra, on va dire « Ah, mais c'est la mise en scène de Peter Brook qu'il a faite pour la première fois pour l'Opéra Bastille en 2005, etc. » ou des choses comme ça. Donc, je me demande s'il y a cette idée de transfert culturel ou d'importation culturelle, puisque vous disiez que c'est important d'avoir un théâtre, pour certains, qui soit le théâtre français, quelque chose de la France, quelque chose de la vie urbaine française qui est transporté jusque dans les Antilles. Mais j'ai une autre question à vous poser, une très très bonne question de la part de Nicholas Cronk, qui vous remercie tous les deux de vos interventions passionnantes et qui dit mais comment est-ce qu'on pourrait faire pour inclure une partie de tout ce que vous avez trouvé dans notre enseignement. Donc, what would be the best way to make these texts most easily available to students? Donc, est-ce qu'il faudrait des petites éditions de poche? Est-ce qu'il faudrait des bases de données en ligne? Comment est-ce qu'il faudrait faire si on voulait? Surtout, Jeffrey a commencé en disant on espère qu'il y aura d'autres travaux. Donc, comment les dynamiser?
Just in terms of the accessibility of texts, I think that a lot of scholars in this volume, and I would say really online access to original editions, has transformed scholarship in the early modern and basically everything prior to sort of modern printing. So many of the texts that are examined in this volume in terms of the theatrical text, the dramatic texts, are actually available in online facsimiles. And so that is much of that canon is already there. It would be interesting to sort of look at different kinds of repertoires, and here we have the great advantage of Julia Press database of theater in Saint-Domingue, which is a really very complete updating of Jean Fouchard's original sort of repertoire lists, to look at what is still unfound or what might have only existed in manuscript, and to see whether or not those are accessible. I think the other, answer is when you find an extraordinary text, as Julia did with Les Veuves Créoles, the critical edition is really useful. But otherwise, I think with relatively few exceptions, just about everything can be found in facsimile editions online. Now, those are not always easy to work with students. They are not annotated. They do not have the sort of introduction that situates things, and so that can be challenging. But in terms of accessing primary sources, much of it really is available.
Alors, de mon côté, je voulais répondre deux choses. Je sais par exemple que ma collègue Émilie Saakian a utilisé dans son cours, dans son séminaire de doctorat, elle travaille également sur la performance avec ses étudiants, et elle a utilisé justement les voix d'esclaves de Dominique Rogers, et elle a proposé à ses étudiants de performer les archives, et elle les a enregistrés lisant les archives. Donc c'était assez émouvant d'entendre ces étudiantes américaines qui lisaient ces textes. Alors, d'autre part, moi-même, j'avais mis au programme de mon cours de littérature du XVIIIe siècle le texte des Veuves Créoles, ce qui m'a permis de leur à la fois de patrimonialiser l'œuvre, donc de la transmettre aux étudiantes martiniquaises, et de leur expliquer l'arrière-plan culturel, social. Et du coup, j'ai deux de ces étudiants qui ont suivi mon cours qui vont jouer la pièce. Donc, ce qui va permettre effectivement leur approfondissement. Et j'avoue que il me semble, alors c'est vrai que la base de données de Julia Prest est extrêmement utile aussi pour les étudiants, et il me semble que c'est extrêmement bien pour ces publics étudiants de varier les possibilités d'approche. Les cours, effectivement, proprement dit, comme nous les connaissons, mais également ces aspects performatifs qui leur donnent l'occasion qui leur donnent d'autres voies d'entrée dans les textes. Discuter avec les chercheurs, ça me paraît fondamental. Là, je vais organiser une séance Zoom avec Julia, qui a cette gentillesse. Discuter avec les chercheurs. Et du coup, je pense que, ça dépend des publics, mais c'est vrai que ça peut être plus facile ensuite pour eux, du coup, de lire des extraits, des essais, plutôt que de s'attaquer directement. Parfois, ça dépend de leur niveau d'études, mais pour les licences, licence 2, licence 3, c'est évident que c'est un peu plus difficile. Et en plus, c'est en anglais. Donc, même si nos étudiants, quand même, se débrouillent bien dans cette langue. Donc, je pense que moi, j'aime bien varier les niveaux d'approche, et c'est pour ça que je suis extrêmement intéressée par la recherche-création, évidemment.
Et Pierre Saint-Amand, que nous saluons au passage, dit à juste titre qu'une anthologie de quelques textes représentatifs pourrait peut-être être un moyen d'avoir un impact véritable. Alors, j'ai une question pour vous de Tom Wynne, qui rejoint absolument une question que je me posais moi-même. What is known of private theatricals, or théâtre de société, in Saint-Domingue?
And so this was one of the reasons why I wanted to initially insist on the fact that we really are working with public theater in this volume. There undoubtedly was private theater, théâtre de société, in Saint-Domingue, but the essays in this volume don't address it. And it is one of the things that I think really is, it's an open domain of research that is, I invite Tom to investigate, but I would not be able to answer it. And again, from the archival work that was done for this volume really was around the records that are available for public performance.
Et Kareem, vous voulez ajouter
quelque chose? Non, j'avoue que je sais que nos auteurs parlent du fait qu'il y avait effectivement, comme dit Jeff, des théâtres de société, mais et moi, de mon côté, je n'ai pas du tout investigué la question, donc je suis désolée, ce sera pour un prochain volume. C'est vrai qu'il y aurait de quoi faire avec Marie-Emmanuelle, peut-être d'Eval Plagnol, qui est spécialiste. Peut-être qu'elle devait venir à l'époque pour le colloque, peut-être que ça l'intéresserait d'ouvrir le travail.
Alors, ce sera peut-être un tome 2 ou un tome 3.
Voilà.
Et justement, alors ce tome-ci est centré sur Saint-Domingue, donc on a parlé beaucoup de la base de Julia Prest. Pour la Martinique, donc, on sait un peu moins de choses, mais qu'est-ce que vous pouvez nous en dire déjà, Karine?
Comme ça, tout à trac.
Ouais.
Alors, c'est vrai que, bon, effectivement, j'ai beaucoup travaillé cette introduction de Julia Prest qui montre qu'il y a eu quand même 2 théâtres importants en Martinique et au théâtre de Saint-Pierre, il y a eu énormément de tournées en fait. C'était un théâtre qui fonctionnait quand même très bien. Même si il n'était pas, oui, il a eu beaucoup de difficultés financières visiblement. Et justement, les veuves créoles, alors là, pour le coup, j'ai un doute. Je crois qu'elles n'ont été jouées qu'une fois en Martinique. Elles ont eu beaucoup plus de succès à Saint-Domingue. Et ça, c'est intéressant parce qu'elles pensent que finalement, les Martiniquais, les créoles, finalement, n'étaient pas intéressés par la représentation de la Martinique elle-même. Ce qu'ils voulaient, c'était ceux qui venaient de la métropole. Et c'est très présent dans le texte d'ailleurs, la mode de la métropole, etc. Et bon, après, oui, il y a eu quand même beaucoup d'opéras qui ont tourné. C'est un théâtre qui était extrêmement vivant. De toute façon, il y avait quand même une très forte population à Saint-Pierre, hein, quand même 35 000 personnes qui ont été anéanties en 1902. Donc, ça a été, oui, ça a été un théâtre extrêmement vivant dont il ne subsiste vraiment plus rien puisque tout a brûlé dans les archives, toutes les archives ont brûlé, etc. Voilà, pour vous faire une petite remarque brève. Et c'est vrai qu'il n'y a pas d'héritage. On sent dans la société martiniquaise l'absence de transmission de ce qui a eu lieu, de ce qui s'est joué, de ce qui s'est fait. Et là, je pense que justement, ça serait intéressant, à l'occasion de mon travail, de ma collaboration avec Julia Prest, d'essayer, et puis d'autres, hein, bien entendu, d'autres chercheurs, notamment avec Bernard Camier. Là, je suis en train de travailler avec lui pour voir, pour essayer de savoir un petit peu ce qui se jouait comme musique au XVIIIe siècle, quel était l'arrière-plan musical, etc. Parce que je crois qu'il y a un vrai travail de transmission à faire, vraiment.
Et du coup, c'est votre prochain projet ou vous travaillez sur autre chose en ce moment?
Alors, bon, j'ai plusieurs projets de recherche-création en même temps, mais ça, c'est mon gros projet, oui, parce que j'ai quand même un label, donc ça suppose qu'on m'a commandé ce spectacle. Donc, j'avoue que toutes mes forces vives sont investies. Donc, je suis très heureuse d'avoir, si je puis dire, ce staff autour de moi. C'est merveilleux. J'ai Julia, j'ai Geoffrey, j'ai Dominique Rogers, j'ai Myriam Cotias, j'ai Bernard Camier et plein d'autres, en fait, qui sont
Quelle équipe! C'est la Dream Team.
J'espère que le spectacle sera à la hauteur parce que c'est quand même un vrai challenge, là.
Merci. Et Jeffrey, I'm going to finish by asking you, what have you got on the back burner, which is about to become your hot topic?
Well, I have a number of irons in the fire. I have a couple of digital humanities projects that are centered around less around sort of textual accumulation or textual analysis through different kinds of machine reading and sort of statistical linguistics. Our angle is much more in a sort of cultural patrimony side of things, and in modeling, virtual reality modeling, and in particular social modeling is the thing that I'm working on with a colleague, a computer scientist at the University of New Orleans, an interactive model that takes into account the sort of social norms of the 18th century, and how can we build a kind of interactive system that both illustrates and perhaps can inductively help people understand elements of 18th century sociability. And so that certainly is one of my major focuses right now.
Well, we look forward to reading more. Now, were we in non-pandemic times, we would all be going off to the pub together, particularly as pubs are now open again in England and the sun is shining. I very much regret that we can't all gather around a table and continue this, but I hope that, as the French say, ce n'est que partie remise. We will look forward to welcoming you here soon. And in the meantime, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for this international three-way conversation. Thank you to Nikki and the team at Torch. Congratulations to the Voltaire Foundation and Liverpool University Press for the beautiful book that they've managed to produce, and congratulations, of course, above all, to you and the team of researchers who worked with you. And greetings to all who've been listening in, and there were a number of familiar names on the list, and I'm sorry again not to have seen you in the flesh, but it's lovely to have known you were there. Have a good evening. Bye bye all.
Take care.
Merci.
The